Gun owners in our country will be watching this parliamentary session closely. After promises made during the campaign, many expect the Liberal government to propose laws aimed at tackling gun violence in Canada. Broad in scope, reports are now surfacing the bill could include a red flag plan, a proposal that would give doctors power to report possible gun owners who could be a risk to themselves or others. To get his thoughts on this, I'm joined by Rod Giltaca, CEO and Executive Director of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. Rod, what concerns you about these so-called red flag gun laws?
Well, we have a number of concerns. Probably chief among them is the fact that red flag laws, an American term for some reason, have existed in Canada for decades and have been used extensively by governments and police and community members and relatives and doctors, for that matter. Right now, all of those authorities exist, all that power exists to cancel a possession and acquisition license, to seize firearms, to take a number of measures to ensure public safety. So our concern is that really two things. Number one, that this is more politics, red meat for the Liberal base. And the other side of it is there really is violence, and there really are concerns for safety, in our country, and those things aren't being addressed.
Hearing what you're saying, I've heard from doctors, though, who do have concerns about the current process. I understand they can currently share concerns to the Chief Firearms Office, which does control gun licensing. Some physicians say, though, it's a long bureaucratic process that can take weeks. I guess, what do you say to that critique?
Well, I think you're talking about a small group of specific doctors. Other groups of doctors actually say the contrary. And the fact of the matter is that these laws have been in place so long, they are exercised very often, and doctors already have tremendous power over the public. If they believe that you're a threat to yourself or anyone else, they can actually have you detained and sedated inside of a hospital right now. So I'm not sure how far they want their powers to reach.
I have heard the concern that mandatory reporting by doctors, it could possibly discourage people from seeking treatment. Is that a concern you share?
Well, that is a concern, and I've personally changed my mind about that because there were some provisions in the past Bill C-71 that there were some privacy concerns, and as a licensed gun owner, I'm concerned with public safety. And I actually had to talk to a few people and get some other opinions, and I think it will discourage people from seeking help because they know that there's a threat that they could be further victimized other than what's going on in their lives at the current time.
I do want to take a look at the numbers, though. According to Statistics Canada, about 75% of gun deaths over the last 16 years are suicide by firearm. Now, supporters of a red flag program say giving doctors these powers might help to reduce that statistic, even by a little, and that we need to look at this from more of a mental health lens and not a criminal one. I guess, what do you say to that argument?
Well, those 75% of firearms-related deaths due to suicide represent actually around 16% of overall suicides in Canada. It's a very small number. And one of the problems that we have is this oversimplification of the issue itself. How many of those people that took their own lives with firearms were terminally ill? How many were in daily pain? We don't know all that stuff, and that's really important. Those are really important mitigating factors to determining what exactly our response should be. So it's just that we need a lot more care taken when we're talking about very far-reaching, very powerful authorities given to people that may or may not use that responsibly.
You mentioned the United States earlier. We know there are about 17 states south of the borders that have similar red flag laws. Do we know anything about the effectiveness down there? I know the situation is much different. Laws are much different in the states, but is there anything we can glean?
Well, and the issue that we have with comparing Canada to the United States is there is no comparison whatsoever. In Canada, we have licensing, we have daily background checks for gun owners. The law supports any gun owner at any time. If there's a public safety concern lodged against a gun owner, the government has full authority to go to that person's home, to seize their firearms, to seize them, to cancel their PAL. All that stuff has existed forever, and that's the frustration that gun owners have, and that's what leaves the only explanation is, again, red meat being thrown to the Liberal base to make it look like they're doing something about violence. And there are problems with violence in Canada. They aren't huge like in the United States, and there are problems with suicide. So we need to focus on reducing suicide and reducing violent behavior, and then everyone wins.
There are other changes being introduced in this multi-pronged gun control strategy I want to get your thoughts on. There's talk of new laws that will tighten requirements for firearms storage, specifically handguns. Of course, there's also legislation that would ban military assault weapons, possible partial handgun bans, and a program for the feds to actually buy back legal guns from gun owners. Because I want to get your thoughts. I know there's a lot there, but what are your thoughts on those proposals?
There is a lot there, but I think if we want to simplify it, which is maybe not always the best thing, but if you want to simplify it, we would have to think about what is the motivation in these new laws? Is it this explosion in gang activity, this ability for gangs to shoot up downtown cores of cities across the country and even engage in violence in rural communities, yet just make bail the next day and they're out doing it again? Is that really the problem? And if so, why are we taking guns away and spending, it could be in the billions of dollars, despite what the Liberals say? Why are we going to spend that money instead of reducing violence in these areas? Why are we going to spend that seizing firearms from people that would go through the trouble and the exposure, the legal exposure, to maintain a firearms license? None of it makes any sense, which leaves the only real explanation, which is more political games when it comes to gun control.
Well, on a final note, of course, we're expecting to learn more and actually see the written details of this bill during this parliamentary sitting. How do you plan to lobby against it?
Well, I think the CCFR as an organization, we're a public education, public relations organization, and our role really is to let Canadians know what the existing laws are. We always want to have Canadians get interested in this topic and go to Stats Can. If you go to Statistics Canada, you'll find all the answers to all these questions, and they're to the contrary of what the Liberals are pushing. So our role is actually to help Canadians understand this issue a little bit better, and if they did, they wouldn't be in support of plans like the Liberals are pushing forward right now.
Well, thank you so much for your time and perspective here today. It's an issue we will certainly be watching, Rod.
It's my pleasure.
Rod Giltaca is CEO and Executive Director of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. It's time for a break, but coming up, the other side of this debate, hear from the physician group calling for more powers through a red flag program. Stay with us. Before the break, we heard from the Firearm Rights Group pushing back on possible legislation that would give doctors more powers to flag gun owners, posing a risk to themselves or perhaps others. But there is a group that has been pushing for such a program for nearly 3 decades. Dr. Alan Drummond is a physician and co-chair of the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, a Public Affairs Committee. Doctor, why do you believe a red flag gun program is needed?
Well, I think it fills in the potential gaps in the current system. It is true that any Canadian citizen can report to the chief firearms officer if they believe that somebody's at risk of holding firearms. The trouble is, in the clinical circumstance of being in the emergency department, we often encounter people who have vague suicidal thoughts. They may not have a plan. We encounter people who may be involved in intimate partner violence in homes. We may encounter people who have psychosis. But unless they express a very direct plan to either end their lives or directly kill others, then we are not actually allowed to report that to the police, because that would be a breach of our oath of confidentiality. And so the red flag law, depending on what that ultimately proves to be beyond a ministerial announcement, would allow physicians to encounter somebody in the emergency department at 3 o'clock in the morning. They are depressed. They have substance abuse. They are talking about suicide, but they have no plan. We do not think that they are in imminent risk of going home and killing themselves that very hour. They do not need to be admitted to a psychiatric facility for mandatory evaluation, but we are going to send them home. And so the question is, are we sending them home to a loaded shotgun in the closet, or are we sending them home to an arsenal in the basement? And we don't know. And so we think that the ability for physicians to report to the police in a fairly much more immediate circumstance than a CFO 1-800 phone call would allow us to temporarily have any firearms from a patient's home temporarily removed until such time as a diagnosis is made, a treatment is initiated, and the crisis is passed.
Well, you mentioned the CFO. You mentioned a program that's already in place. And of course, our earlier guest pointed out that this program does exist, the Chief Firearms Office. Why do you need more powers, though? I guess walk me through what that process of reporting a concern can look like.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that your former speaker says, well, we've already got that process in place. This is a duplicate. So if it's a duplicate, then why is it so threatening to his particular group? I have really no idea. But here's the deal. When somebody comes into my emergency department at 3 o'clock in the morning and they are frankly suicidal, or they are really psychotic and want to shoot up the local Baptist church, it becomes really straightforward. We mandate a psychiatric evaluation. They're sent to a psychiatric facility. They are evaluated, and if necessary, they are treated, and the guns can be removed under those circumstances. The bigger problem is that for every one person who comes into the emergency department with a plan, there's a handful at least, sometimes as many as 10, who come in with a vague plan. And, we're sending them home. And the question is, it may be 4 or 5 days before they see a psychologist, a mental health worker, a psychiatrist, a family doctor. Are we sending them home to a dangerous circumstance? We cannot, as of this moment, call the police directly and say, we're sending this person home, but we have some concerns about access to firearms. Could you temporarily intervene, remove those firearms until the situation becomes a little bit more certain? And it's really, confidentiality is a major issue for physicians. It's a serious tenet of our practice. Mm-hmm. But we have that already. Society has allowed us, for the greater societal good, beyond the rights of the individual, to report an individual who may be demented and unsafe to drive, a pilot who is alcoholic, unrepentant, still drinking, and flying his Cessna 150 over Red Deer. We are mandated to report certain communicable diseases. We are mandated to report people that are perpetrators of child abuse. Tell me how it's different if we suggest that there's somebody who is seriously depressed or seriously psychotic and has an arsenal in their basement, and we're going to send them home to that. Yeah. I don't understand what the issue is.
I do want to pick up on what you had mentioned, though. I guess that process that you envision perhaps in the future of doctors being able to directly call police and have a temporary injunction or search to see if this person might even own a firearm. What you're suggesting, I imagine that might spur some privacy concerns. I guess, have you thought of that, or I guess constitutional challenges possibly?
Well, we have thought of that, and I think it's a valid concern. I mean, confidentiality is an issue, to be sure, which is why we're not broaching this subject very lightly. But as I mentioned, historically, the government has given us powers for greater societal good beyond the rights of an individual to protect the broader society in circumstances of people driving trucks, cars, trains, airplanes, and so forth. So it fits within that context. You should also know that a number of years ago, in 2003, in Ontario, there was a mandated law pushed by an emergency physician such that if anybody showed up with an actual gunshot wound in the emergency department, that the police be immediately reported on the understanding that if bullets are flying around a community, then not only the person who's been shot, but others may be injured. And in Quebec, following the shooting at the Montreal Cégep Dawson College, the Quebec government introduced Anastasia's law, which essentially gives physicians and educators in that province the exact same power as would be enacted in a red flag law.
Yeah, so
it already exists in Canada.
Perhaps precedent. Okay, I want to sneak in a comment from the federal government on this. We did want to get more information from the Liberal government about their plans. In a statement from the Office of the Ministry of Public Safety, they say in part, quote, our government wants to empower not just the police, but doctors, individuals in domestic abuse situations, communities, and families to raise a flag on people who pose a risk to themselves or an identifiable group, ensuring they do not have access to firearms. We will be announcing details of our government's plan to reduce gun violence in the near future, which will come as each step is ready to be implemented. Of course, we're all watching and waiting to see if such a program could come into effect this parliamentary sitting. I guess final word from you. How do you hope to work with the government on this? What will you be doing moving forward?
Well, we will be supportive of the government. I mean, this is not, as suggested by your previous guest, a partisan issue and a gun grab. We are talking about human lives. We are talking about lives that prematurely end. we are talking about shattered families and shattered communities. This is not about your ability to take your gun out on the weekend and shoot a target. This is about people that, for whatever reason, whatever emotional underlying issues they have,